Talvez a gente podia começar com uma pergunta para o Nicoll, mas quem quiser comentar também, fique à vontade para comentar. Que é uma pergunta que apareceu de várias pessoas, do Robson Melo, do Rio de Janeiro, apareceu também do Hugo Arada, que é uma pergunta que fala sobre como é que você combina esse movimento inovador na educação com um currículo. Você precisa de uma reforma curricular para fazer para conseguir implementar um ambiente mais inovador, e como é que você lida com avaliações externas? Como é que você permite tanta autonomia das crianças e combina isso com uma prova ao final do ano ou para entrar na universidade, que é a mesma prova que a gente tem há tantos anos?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think it depends a little bit upon each circumstance. Let me just give a sort of a broad answer and then a slightly more specific one. On the broad answer of whether you need to change the content and assessments, I actually think that what we see through blended learning is that you can learn the contents that are expected to be learned in the curriculum much more efficiently and faster through blended learning than you can through a traditional method. And so it's not necessarily that the standards that we want people to achieve in their schooling are all of a sudden bad standards per se, but that we can actually do it in much better ways and then open up opportunities to do a lot of what we saw in the presentations today, to actually create around these things and actually learn these standards in far deeper ways than just cramming for that test so that we can skate by. One of the things that I think we often mistake about some assessments is we say, oh, it's the test that's bad, when really it's our preparation for the test that's been bad, the way that we've sort of crammed it and drilled it into you just so that you can pass something without actually really having deep understanding. The one caveat I should say to this is that there's a lot of countries in this world. I just got back from 5 weeks in Vietnam and Korea, and in Vietnam specifically, for example, the national curriculum isn't just the content that you should learn, but instead it's a time-based one. So every single fourth grade teacher in the entire country has to teach the exact same math lesson to every single student, regardless of whether they're ready for it. That is going to be completely counter to blended learning, and it's going to be impossible to implement it and do the personalization, Alison, that you do in an environment like that. And my longer-term expectation is that the system of assessments that we have needs to change. So rather than having one assessment, I'll just use Alison's class again. She's probably got students that are way above grade level, students that came in 3 years below, and she's able to make 2 years of progress with them. So maybe they were a first grade level in reading, and they get up to the third grade level by the end of the year. That's amazing. But the test is a fourth grade quote-unquote test. And so it's not going to show the progress that her students actually made, which is not fair, nor does it give us real accountability. And I think the future of assessments should be things that are almost built in and on demand, so that as students master something, they can show right then and there that they actually know it, and that'll be way more accountable, because every single day of the year we should know how every single child is doing. And assessments can be both objective things as well as performance-based projects.
A gente tem uma série de perguntas que estão direcionadas a entender melhor o papel do professor, né? Uma delas é da Maria de Lourdes, né? Gostaria de saber qual seria o perfil, as competências e habilidades que um professor precisa ter para atuar diante dessa nova realidade. E como preparar, essa do Antônio de São Paulo, como preparar, então, os professores e educadores para usar essas novas metodologias, essas tecnologias. Como é que... Eu acho que a gente tem muito professor na plateia, tem professor aqui também. O que vocês acham?
Posso começar? Eu acho... Isso veio de uma leitura do livro do Khan, do Salman Khan, Um Novo Mundo, Nova Escola, né? Um Mundo, Uma Escola, que algumas sociedades, a brasileira, não tenho dúvida de que estigmatiza o fracasso de tal forma que paralisa nossas condutas. Isso na escola a gente visualiza todo dia, de fato. E como superar isso de fato, né? Porque nas universidades, infelizmente, nas licenciaturas, a gente não tem tempo prático para aprender a dar aula de fato. A frequentar o ambiente de sala é uma minoria do tempo que acontece isso hoje nas melhores universidades do país. Então a gente tem que superar esse medo de não dar certo dentro de sala de aula, de superar o medo que o aluno não vá. Ele pode abortar um projeto no meio do caminho e tudo bem. Acho que o professor também pode abortar algumas sequências didáticas no meio do caminho e tentar na prática ali. A gente não pode esperar as universidades mudarem os seus currículos para fazer dentro de sala de aula o que a gente acredita no que é educação. A gente tem que fazer isso já. A realidade da educação brasileira, nós sabemos, é um grande buraco, se a gente for esperar. Acho que superar o medo do fracasso, confiar nas possibilidades. Se a gente visualizar que não vai dar certo, não vai dar certo. A gente tenta diferente, tenta de novo. E não insistir no fracasso.
Quais são essas competências, Alison, essas habilidades que esse professor precisa ter para realizar um trabalho como você e o Luís estão fazendo?
In America, in my school, in schools across America, I believe what needs to change first is the mindset of a teacher. Teachers either have a growth mindset or a fixed mindset. If you are, I need to take this off, I'm getting distracted. If a teacher is doing something good and they are a good teacher and their program works for them, then they're not willing to change. But the way that they're teaching is the same way as teachers taught 100 years ago. Again, I told you, I stood in front of 33 kids. That has to change. And so we have to change the mindset of the teacher that they are still important, but that their role becomes more of a coach. No one should be standing in front of a classroom teaching a variety of students who have different needs. Personalization of education is the way to go. And the way that that occurs first is explaining to teachers that they have to be open to new ways. I didn't even know I was going to change the way I was teaching until I saw Khan Academy and I saw the data. Even though I was a traditional teacher, I wanted data. I wanted data to know that this was a good program. As you know, at least in my country, the pendulum always swings. We hear, this is the best program. Everyone's got to teach this way. And everyone learns it, and then 8 years later, we hear, no, that's not the best way. Let's try this way. But I can't see that ever changing with the online learning because of the personalization of it. Teachers have to get past giving up control. For some teachers, that's very difficult. That's why they don't want to give up standing in front of 33 kids. But kids rise to the challenge. And if teachers teach procedures, which I had to spend a lot of time on for my 4 centers, the kids can learn on their own. And I'm okay with that. I'm just more strategic with my teaching, but just as important.
Obrigado, Alison e Luís. A gente tem uma pergunta aqui que veio pelo Twitter do Jeff Lipman para o Zach, perguntando um pouco sobre que idade tem os seus usuários da Code Academy e como quão longe eles vão, né, na plataforma e se eles conseguem persistir ou se eles acabam abandonando cedo. E na mesma linha, uma pergunta que acho que o Zach pode responder bem, mas os outros quiserem comentar também podem. Muitas pessoas falam que o ensino online demanda muita autodisciplina, que não é fácil você persistir sem ter a classe, sem ter todo mundo ao seu lado. Como é que vocês estão usando para aumentar o engajamento dos alunos nas plataformas? Essas perguntas vieram também da Patrícia Sakovski e do Felipe Gibi.
Great. So I think the first question was, who are our users and how old are they? So I think I mentioned this in my presentation. Codecademy is a platform that lets anyone create lessons. So with more than 100,000 courses created by people all over the world, we can help someone, whether they're 14 or 15 or whether they're 60 or 70, to learn different aspects of programming. And what we see is that the quality of all that content obviously varies as well, which affects how much people complete different things. But I think the difference between what we do and what a lot of other online education companies do is we break things up around skills and into really discrete and finite units. So we have people who come on the website when they're 14 and they just want to build a website about themselves. And that takes 2 or 3 hours to learn to build, and they can finish that and come back later when they're interested in learning other skills. So I think this idea of completion rates on online courses changes with how you present the online courses themselves. When courses and engagement and retention are no longer about who finishes a 3-month course with a syllabus that's been established by a university, but instead becomes who played a game to learn a certain skill, it becomes very different. So when we think about, I think the second part of the question was, how do we keep people engaged? We do it by not teaching courses and by instead making people work on projects. So learning is focused on doing and actually making things. So there's a concrete outcome. You're always focused on sort of the next milestone. It's not just learning skills to focus on a test or a quiz or an assessment, but it's learning to learn, to build things, to show other people, and to better your life. So I think online learning is definitely hard to stay focused with and to stay on track with. But when you build something that's native sort of for the web and that's exciting and fun, it's a lot easier to use and a lot easier to stay engaged than it is if you take an offline construct like a class and bring it online.
Yeah, this is a really important point, and I'm glad Zach brought it up, because sometimes when he uses the word courses, people picture a 3-month sort of long unit or something like that, and basically they imagine taking a classic college course and simply putting it online, and that's not at all what you guys do. Instead, you basically say, what are the users trying to get done in their lives, and how can we facilitate that happening? And when you understand what the users are actually trying to get done, what students actually want out of the experience, then you can customize or create experiences that match their motivations for coming in. It's not that, contrary to popular belief, it's not that students are unmotivated. It's just that the things that we're offering are not often what they're motivated to actually achieve or learn. And so it's really understanding that and then constructing around something around their motivation that causes them to complete. And the last point quickly, I just think in the K through 12 environment, where we do have certain things that every child needs to master at a basic, blended learning is going to be a really important part of it.
One last note to that. I think we're really in the early days of online education, and what a lot of people are doing now is they're taking the classroom and they're bringing it online. And that's the same thing we did with banner advertisements in the 1990s before Google came along and invented something that was so much better because it used what technology was good for. And I think that's what we're trying to do with education. It's what other people are trying to do with education, is start from what you can do with technology, with distribution, with data, with interactivity, and build an experience that's new and totally different than what came before it, than what came with the factory model. So technology really gives us the opportunity to just rethink everything you can do with the way people learn.
Tenho duas perguntas para o David. A primeira, do Caetano, como vocês fazem com a diversidade de interesse dos alunos? Como atender essa pluralidade? E a segunda, vocês falam muito do contexto prático, de aprender fazendo, desenvolvendo projetos. Isso que a pergunta é, se algo a ser ensinado não encontrar um contexto prático, então esse conteúdo não deve ser ensinado na escola? Seria uma perda de tempo?
I don't think anything you learn at all is really a waste of time. I think sometimes there might appear to be no immediate need for something you've learned, but later in life that's going to come back. The one exception to that is probably trigonometry, which I will go to my grave before I ever have to use trigonometry. So I think there are some things that don't lend themselves easily to practical learning, but you shouldn't abandon them simply because of that. I think we also have to be clear about what do we mean by hands-on learning and practical learning. It doesn't mean building a brick wall. It might mean carrying out a health survey for the local hospital, within your community. That's practical learning. It might be young people developing a social media strategy for emerging companies. That's practical learning. We think of it as this hands-on thing, but it's not always hands-on in the traditional sense. The first part of the question, could you remind me?
The interests of how to...
Oh yeah, balancing the interests, that is very difficult. There's no question about that. Studio Schools is, the whole idea was first developed around 2005, 2006, but we didn't have the first school open until September 2010. And we had to spend quite a lot of time persuading politicians and policymakers that this is something they should do, because this doesn't come naturally to them. They've all succeeded in the conventional system and therefore think it's the best of all possible systems. So at an early stage, we gave up describing it to them as an education solution and said to them, this is a labour market solution. It's about preparing young people to succeed in work in life. But we were always very conscious that you had to do that within the conventional framework that all schools, all secondary schools, operate inside in the UK. England has a very powerful independent regulatory system as well. There's an organisation called Ofsted, and Ofsted expect to see schools do certain things, and they don't care what type of school that is. They've got to conform to it. You've got to provide what employers are looking for as well. The reality is it's been less difficult than it sounds. And I think that's in part because we have highly motivated, self-selecting individuals coming forward to create studio schools and to work in them. There are 28 of them in England right now. There'll be 70 within a year and a half. But actually there are 3,000 secondary schools in England. So it's not really very difficult to get enough people to work with 70 or 100 or 200 schools and do all of these things and meet all these stakeholders' requirements because they're highly motivated to do it. I think if you were asking me, could that be done with 1,000 schools? I suspect the answer is no. You'd need a huge system-wide shift to do that.
Tem duas perguntas aqui que eu vou fazer para a Alison. Uma vem da... Não consigo ler exatamente. Lana, acho, de São Paulo. E pergunta a Alison como a escola, a direção e outros professores receberam o seu programa. Você teve apoio? Houve alguma dificuldade? Quais? Isso mudou o trabalho dos outros professores? Né? Então, a pergunta se há uma mudança só na sua sala ou se essa é uma mudança maior na escola e como foi recebido. E tem uma pergunta que eu vou juntar, do Marco Aurélio, de Sorocaba, que pergunta quantos alunos devem ter em uma sala de aula para conseguir aplicar o ensino híbrido e o sistema de estações, o Station Rotation. Precisa ser uma sala específica ou pode ser em qualquer sala? Ele é professor de matemática e está fazendo essa pergunta.
The second one first. And in my classroom, I have 33 students. And the amount of students that I have, it doesn't impact what I'm doing. If a student is absent, I just make the group smaller. So I have 33 students. Now, the question that you asked about how it was received is a question that I get all the time. My principal, Rich Julian, is the cause for me to be able to do this program, because when I told him that I was sold on it and I love the data, but I wasn't quite sure what to do with it, he encouraged me and he told me, take a risk, create what you think is a good idea, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I had complete support from my principal. I had support from my superintendent. I had support from, not to brag, but I've had support from the world. I mean, a lot of people have come to observe me. But at my own school, it's sort of strange. Not a lot of people at my school has come to observe me. I think teachers in general, again, like I told you before, believe if they are doing something that works, why change? Why go observe somebody that's doing something different? I am a totally different person than that. There was a teacher at my school that was doing the Socratic method with her 6th graders, and I always had interest in understanding how that worked. So I asked her, could I come observe? My principal got me a sub for a half day, and I went to observe her. But not a lot of my teachers come to observe me. Not a lot of the teachers continue with what I'm doing. And it's a hard question because I don't want to insult the teachers at my school. I think they're wonderful people and wonderful teachers. But it is strange to me when people come to observe me from other countries and yet the teachers at my school don't. I don't have an answer to why that is, other than the fact that I don't really know. I can't answer that question because I don't want to insult anybody. I don't really know why. But from the district, the administration, the Board of Education, I have received a lot of support and a lot of attention. I hope that answers your question.
Vou tentar atender aqui a demanda dos empreendedores que estão na sala, né? O Igor Souza e o Yuri Ramos, eles fazem uma pergunta para o Zé. Como você ganha dinheiro com o Codecademy? Qual o modelo de negócios cobrar dos usuários? E aí a Ana Luísa Santos, do Rio de Janeiro, faz a mesma pergunta para o David. Qual é o modelo de negócios da Studio Schools?
So we're a for-profit company. We have raised about $12 million in venture capital financing from investors in the US and across the world. And we're pre-business model. So that said, I think the hope of Codecademy is that we've drastically lowered the cost of providing an education to anyone across the world, right? We're not creating the content, so we're not paying large groups of people in-house to create content. We're merely acting as the platform that connects people who want to teach with people who want to learn. And at the end of the day, I think we want to eventually profit by helping the people that are learning on the platform find opportunities that are good for them. So whether that's finding a job or finding work online, what we want to eventually do is make money by helping them achieve sort of their goals and potentials. So, but we don't make money now.
You spend money.
We spend lots of money.
In England, the majority of schools are funded by either direct from central government or by the local authority, but in the end it's all taxpayers' money that funds the schools. Our schools are funded exactly the same way that every state-funded school is funded, which is to say, depending on where you're based, because there's a local and regional element to this, but if you have a school in Birmingham, you're going to get the equivalent for every pupil of roughly 24,000 Brazilian real every year. And if you're a studio school in Birmingham, you get that 24,000 real. So that pays entirely. Parents don't make any contribution, nor do employers. Some people have sometimes asked if businesses should pay for the studio schools, but our view, and I think their view as well, is they pay for the education system through general taxation, so there's no reason why they should double pay. So state-funded schools, basically.
I'd like to know how many of you have heard of or used Khan Academy. You know then it's translated into Portuguese. And if there's anybody in here that hasn't checked it out, I thoroughly enjoy it. I thoroughly recommend you to check it out today. It is so easy to learn. The data is so rich. And I believe, honestly, that if every teacher checked it out, they would change the way that they are teaching. And in terms of cost, there never will be a cost. So in my school, we adopted another program, another online program, that there's a severe cost. Teachers have to pay, or the district has to pay licenses fee for that program, and the program stinks. I mean, the data is not easy to access. Whereas with Khan Academy, you know, it's sort of like data for dummies, and that's me. I'm not good on computers, but the data is so rich. I promise you, if you haven't looked at it, all you have to do is have a Gmail address and get on it this afternoon.
Quem quiser conhecer, a gente tem uma sala de experimentação esse ano, que é uma das novidades do Transformar, que na hora do almoço, se vocês quiserem ver, um pedaço de vocês se inscreveu para isso, está completamente lotado, então se você não se inscreveu, não vá durante o horário da tarde, mas pode ir nos breaks e durante o almoço, e quando a gente estiver terminando aqui. E lá tem 10 experiências, a maioria delas de startups brasileiras que criaram plataformas, e também a Khan Academy em português, para quem quiser conhecer. A Code Academy também está lá, para quem quiser conhecer, assim como uma série de outras experiências bacanas, num ambiente... Não é tão legal quanto a sala de aula da Alison, mas pelo menos tem uma carinha de sala de aula e dá para... Como deveria ser, talvez, uma sala de aula. Pegando um pouco um gancho nisso, tem duas perguntas aqui que dizem respeito à implementação, né? A primeira é aqui do Maurício Calazans, do Rio de Janeiro. Sabemos que as escolas públicas e particulares são engessadas e tradicionais. Qual o melhor caminho para a implementação de modelos inovadores? Através dos alunos, através dos professores, através dos gestores, né? Acho que o Nicoll, talvez, que fez uma pesquisa extensa sobre isso, talvez possa começar respondendo. E nessa mesma linha, Nicoll, já que você vai estar com a palavra, o Carlos Coutinho pergunta: qual a sua opinião sobre separar os alunos em séries? E quais alternativas você sugere?
Both good questions. So since we're doing the plugs for various things, I'll start with that, which is we just launched on last Monday. Brian Greenberg from the Silicon Schools Fund and I launched a course on the Khan Academy for teachers and principals about how to do blended learning and how to start innovating and how to move in this direction. So it's a very practical guide where we actually show films and footage from real schools that have moved to blended learning and ask them what they've done and how they've designed the different models that they've put into place. So that's the plug. The shorter answer, I think, is that there's sort of two pathways that you can go within your school. One, an individual teacher, like we've seen here with Alison, can move to a station rotation, or how many people have heard of flipped classroom? So a fair number of people. These are sorts of innovations that you can do tomorrow in your school. Basically, all you need to do is get a little bit of technology in a station rotation. You don't need a computer for every single child because you can have multiple stations so that they can rotate through different computers and that they can start doing things like Khan Academy with parts of the time, and you would start to change your teaching profession. I'd recommend you put a little planning and thought into it beforehand, but there's that pathway for a classroom teacher to do that. The other option is if you know your students have home devices, whether it's mobile phones or internet-connected laptops, you can start to create videos or use Khan Academy or other resources and literally flip your classroom so that the time you spend in the classroom will be on guided practice and projects, and at home, that's when they'll actually learn the content online. That can happen tomorrow. The other pathway that I'd recommend is for school leaders that look at those areas of quote-unquote non-consumption, where you'd like to be able to offer an experience for your students, but you haven't been able to, for a budget reason, or because there's not a highly qualified teacher, or whatever it might be. But surely there are actually examples and teachers out there in the world that are offering those courses that you'd like to be able to deliver to your students. And so to be able to, in those areas of non-consumption, create wholly new models that give students those opportunities, I think is a big experience. My big statement overall would be start with the problem you're trying to solve or the goal you're trying to achieve. Think about the student experience you want to design. Then think about the teacher experience. And only after you've thought about those things, only then start to ask the questions about technology and content. Do not lead with technology. There are too many districts throughout the world and schools throughout the world that say it's all about technology for technology's sake. It is the exact wrong way to approach this. It should be for learning's sake, and then the technology is in support of it. That is the biggest advice that I can give you, is the technology comes at the end, not the beginning.
Eu tenho duas perguntas aqui que falam muito sobre diversidade de realidades socioeconômicas. A primeira, como aproximar essas inovações educacionais da realidade de comunidades, bairros com realidades socioeconômicas muito distintas. E a segunda, do Bruno Novelli, como também permitir que essas inovações não atendam simplesmente às necessidades do mercado de trabalho que ele imprime, mas também às necessidades de mudança social em um mundo, e mais especificamente no nosso caso, em um país tão desigual.
I'd like to address the low-income students, because that's the one paragraph I forgot in my speech. And so I told you that I have a school, I teach at a school with 40% of the kids in poverty. And so in my classroom, the homework is flipped. So what that means is for whatever playlist I'm given, I give them for homework, they have to watch Sal's video. And so they learn the concept at home. And that's where the teacher mindset has to change, because the teacher usually is the deliverer of content. But teachers have to be okay with Sal, in my case, teaching the content. And then they come to school to practice the content, where the teacher is there to assist, where the teacher is there to clear up the misconceptions, where the teacher is there to analyze why the student got it wrong. Now, with the low-income kids in my class, there are 6 students that do not have computers at home. That's not their fault. We don't penalize them, obviously. So 4 of those students at my school go to a learning lab after school, a beautiful lab, 21st century, where there's a certificated teacher, there's Chromebooks. And so those 4 out of my 6 go to the learning center, and they do their homework there. Out of the 6, there's 2 that for whatever reason can't go. So my solution was to have them come in the classroom first thing in the morning, and they do their video watching then. And I make sure that the work that I'm teaching then, or the work that the kids are working on, is something that these 2 boys could easily do at homework. Something like vocabulary, word work, grammar, things that don't really need teacher teaching. And so that's how I've solved the kids that don't have the resources at home.
Just a couple thoughts that I'll add on. First, on the low-income question, and then I'll do the labor market question. On the low-income question, the school that I put up there from Los Angeles, again, it's 92% poverty, students in poverty that serves. And what the school leaders across, I think, the world are starting to see is that wealthier students are getting these opportunities regardless. Outside of school, they're opting into these experiences and showing up to kindergarten already knowing all their numbers, already being able to read. And it's the poor students, unless we provide these sorts of experiences, that we're shortchanging. And so we need our public schools to be able to do that. So what happened in this 90% low-income school is that their budget had been cut over the summer. They had been planning to open as a 5-classroom school for kindergarten with 20 students in each class. And the budget got cut such that they could not afford one of the teachers. And so they had to open with only 4 classrooms with many, many more students in each classroom. And what they decided was, if we can actually add 1 student on top of that, so we're going to go to 28 to 30 students each class, that'll give us enough revenue that we can use that money to afford 1 computer for every 3 children. And that will allow us to do this station rotation model. And so someone earlier asked about student-teacher ratios. And I think the question is less about the ratios and asking yourself more about what's the most effective learning environment for my students. is there a big difference between 24 students in one class versus 26 if that means that now I can do a station rotation in my classroom? That might be a trade-off that's worth making and that we need to think through to figure out what's the right use of dollars and technology for each of these students. On the labor market question, this one's a little bit more tricky, and there's more because there's a lot of different ways to answer it. The first one is I would be wary of getting into false juxtapositions between learning for the love of learning and liberal arts and labor market learning. I think what we're seeing in the 21st century with the 4 C's that you laid out is that really those are the cornerstones of a good liberal arts education, and they are absolutely critical to workforce or vocational. This sort of delineation between these things is becoming fuzzier and fuzzier, and we have to be careful not to set them up at odds with each other. The second thing, I think, is that what we're seeing is that students can master basic and core skills much faster in these environments, which should open up opportunities for them to actually be able to free range around and explore different topics to figure out what are they passionate about, what do they want to be, what do they want to learn about. And that's a big opportunity, I think, to open up in this. And the last thing I'd say is you're hearing from the Minerva Project this afternoon, Ben Nelson. They're an online university that brings in a creative use of brick and mortar that was just created. Their first class of students is going to be in the fall. And it is the return to a liberal arts education in a way that does not exist anywhere in this world anymore, in a very innovative way, and it's using online technology. So I think you'll see that these things are not at odds with each other. It really goes back to what is good learning.
Mini comentário, eu acho que muitas vezes quando a gente ouve essas discussões, parece que é muito difícil de fazer. Então não vai dar certo se os alunos forem deu certo nos Estados Unidos, mas não vai dar certo aqui. Dá certo se for numa área rica, mas não vai dar certo na... Eu acho que tem 3 mitos que talvez muito do que foi falado aqui tem que ajudar a gente a derrubar. A maioria de nós criou uma visão sobre tecnologia 15, 20 anos atrás, que tinha 3 coisas que hoje são muito diferentes. A primeira delas é que tecnologia só servia para massificar. E como a gente ouviu por todo mundo aqui, a gente está falando de personalização. Hoje, tudo que a gente usa de tecnologia que é bom, está personalizando, está indo atrás, está ficando mais inteligente para você. Não mais inteligente em geral, ou melhor em geral, mas aquilo que funciona para você. Isso tem tudo a ver com educação. A segunda coisa é que tecnologia era difícil de usar. A gente tinha essa ideia, fica com essa ideia. Tecnologia é difícil, os professores vão resistir. Acho que esse comentário da Alison é muito importante para todo mundo que puder visitar as estações de experimentação ou depois pesquisar, dar um Google, vai atrás dos termos e das experiências que foram faladas aqui e vocês vão ver, ou vai no Porvir e ver tudo que tem lá, você vai ver que a imensa maioria dessas coisas hoje é muito simples de ser usada, é muito intuitivo, né? Da mesma maneira que o nosso smartphone e assim por diante. E a última coisa é que tudo era muito caro. E hoje, como a gente ouve, quase tudo que é muito bom é grátis em tecnologia para o usuário. Não quer dizer que não custa nada, custa para alguém. Mas para o usuário final, muitas dessas coisas são gratuitas. Então a gente tem que parar de olhar, acho, com medo para o que está vindo e mais com uma oportunidade para o Brasil dar um salto que a gente não tinha antes. Mas esse mindset é importante. Desculpa invadir o espaço das perguntas. E aí passar direto para o Luís. Luís, a pergunta do Fernando, aqui de São Paulo, ele fala: Caro Luís, a experiência que você compartilhou do primeiro livro é emocionante e animadora. Como abranger com o mesmo espírito outras áreas do currículo? O que mais dá para fazer, além das crianças aprenderem a escrever seus livros?
Acho que tudo, né? O primeiro livro é uma experiência baseada em projeto. E aqui a gente teve diversos exemplos de experiências baseadas em projeto. Eu ouvi uma vez conversando que o primeiro livro era uma espécie de chassi, que você poderia trocar a literatura, por exemplo, e colocar diversos outros projetos na mão dos estudantes para que eles cresçam aprendendo e criando, e de fato a gente pode fazer isso de diversas maneiras. Eu acompanhei no final do ano passado uma experiência baseada em projeto de um aluno, o Carlos Daniel, que queria resolver o problema do lixo no mundo. E depois, conversando, ele começou a pensar em resolver o problema do lixo no bairro mesmo, no Recanto Suave, ali pertinho da escola. E outros estudantes começaram a também participar do projeto, montaram um grupo de mais ou menos 12 estudantes, ali entre 9 anos e 13, E com a tutora, eles vão ali na comunidade, é uma favelinha que tem um córrego que, quando chove muito, enche, e o rio é poluído ali, o córrego é poluído e perde tudo, né? Você não reaproveita quando tem uma enchente. E o grupo está pensando ali em desenvolver uma maneira de tratar o lixo de forma consciente, indo na comunidade, conversando com os moradores, descobrindo lugares de engajar as pessoas, os adultos, as crianças todas. A primeira reunião foi num bar, por exemplo, né? E depois da primeira reunião, o dono do bar resolveu construir por conta própria ali um lugarzinho para colocar o lixo reciclado. Depois disso, algumas mães quiseram enfeitar onde o dono do bar fez o espaço para o lixo reciclado, fazendo uma oficina de mosaico e engajando as pessoas, baseado numa ideia de uma criança, né, que está ali pensando em resolver o lixo do bairro. É um chassi, essa aprendizagem baseada em projeto. As ideias são todas possíveis na nossa cabeça. Fazer.
Tem várias perguntas aqui que se referem a um novo modelo de escola. A gente está falando de sala de aula, mas as pessoas querem saber como é que seria essa escola diferente. Como é que ela se organiza fisicamente, como ela se organiza pedagogicamente, como ela engaja os professores, como ela planeja. Enfim, se vocês pudessem compartilhar a visão que vocês têm dessa nova escola.
It's pretty complicated. We've got a framework in England now where theoretically almost anybody can apply to the government to create a new type of school. And we occasionally have groups of parents or groups of teachers getting in touch with us to say, we've heard about studio schools, we'd like to create this model, we'd like to work with you. We always tell them that we can't work with them because actually it's a very complex thing to do. You need to have some sort of infrastructure to take you through. You've got to have some sort of experience. You've got to understand the regulatory framework that schools work in. So I don't think we should understate the difficulties in creating new models of school. I think the other thing that's really important, I mean, listening to the whole thing today, is to think about local context. Because some things that appear to work very well in one place are not going to work very well in another. I was listening to Alison's discussion about her classroom and thought that in England, most students would slit their wrists before they do something like that because the British are emotionally reticent and simply wouldn't display that level of enthusiasm. I used to work for IBM many years ago, and we'd get managers coming across from America, and they'd try and enthuse us, and they'd be met with horrible blank stares. It wasn't that people weren't serious about their jobs, they just didn't express themselves that way. So I think you've got to be very cautious about taking these things that look attractive and thinking we can simply do them here. They're difficult, and local context is key. If I can say just one other thing from a previous question, we talked about poverty and the difficulties of, I suppose, the difficulties of doing these things with poorer students. The reality is, because there's a sense that poverty makes things more difficult, the reality is a lot more nuanced than that, actually. In some communities, poverty is an issue for education. So in the United Kingdom, it's a much more ethnically diverse grouping than we used to have. If you saw that, if you remember the photograph from I think it was the 1920s actually, all of the kids were white British. Now that's not very true. And people, particularly people in London, will tell you, look at the great results we are getting and we have really poor communities. They're actually immigrant communities, and immigrant communities tend to see education as a vehicle for social mobility. We have a big problem in the indigenous population, the Aboriginal population, if you like, poor white British students do not do very well in school. And they don't do very well in school, no matter how many resources you throw at it, because neither they nor their parents see educational as a route for social mobility. So you've got to think about who are your target audiences. Don't just assume that because it works somewhere, it will work with you. Who are your target audiences, and adapt your own solutions to those audiences.
Yeah, I completely agree. Those are great points, and not getting into a one-size-fits-all solution across all populations is exactly right. And I think the only thing, so we could tell you what we think, all of us go around and tell you what we think the future of school will or should look like, and the only thing we can predict confidently is that we'll all be wrong. But that said, I'll give a stab at it, because I realized I didn't answer the second question that you asked me before about grade levels and age. So I'll combine that in to try to answer the idea. I think the age grade question is an interesting one. For those of you that have read Sal Khan's book, you know that he cites evidence there that actually having students of mixed ages in an environment together actually can be very beneficial for a lot of the peer teaching reasons that Alison mentioned earlier and so forth. I think regardless of where you come out on that, what we see is that blended learning breaks a lot of the trade-offs, though, that we used to have to make in the old system. And what I mean by that is, in the traditional factory model system, at the end of a year, for a student who had not mastered had not mastered the material, skills, knowledge, dispositions, we had this choice, which was, do we keep them behind a year so that they'll actually learn this, and then therefore hold them away from the rest of their friends and peers who will continue to advance? Or do we promote them socially because we don't really want to do that to them? It's not very nice to keep them away from their friends, and we'll just let them get farther and farther behind as they continue to progress in their subjects. And the great thing about blended learning is you don't have to make that trade-off anymore. You can stay with your friends even as you personalize the learning for where you are individually. We really start to break this apart. So I imagine that in the future, we won't have classrooms. I actually forbid that use of the word within my think tank, because I think it traps us into this model of age and 4 rooms of a classroom, and all learning happens when you look at me. And I think of learning environments, learning studios, open, flexible spaces. And my sense for anyone building a school in the future is I don't know exactly what it should look like, but I wouldn't start with the egg crate classroom school design. I think that they can be leaner and greener and actually much more open learning spaces that encourage students to want to be there, that are warm places, that encourage creativity, and are not linoleum floor-lined things with flickering fluorescent lights that sort of turn students off to learning. And I actually think they'll be far more affordable as a result to build as well. The schools that I see that are what I would think of as next generation schools actually cost a lot less to build than do these massive classroom-based traditional mausoleums to the past.
I think Michael mentioned this earlier when he was talking about how much change has happened in the past 20 or 30 years, where you can now carry all the computing power in the world in your pocket. And as a part of all that change, almost every industry has been reinvented around the consumer and who actually uses the product. And the last place that hasn't happened is education, where we worry about so many different entrenched constituencies. We worry about placing people in grade levels because it's easier to teach to them. Not because it's better for the students, but because it's easier to teach to them. And I think the educational model of the future that will hopefully win will be one that takes students into consideration as the first concern. How can you build the best education for each individual student? The same way Amazon or any sort of online shopping website builds the best way for you to shop, we should have the best way for you to learn. And I think that's, in whatever school environment we have, we're reaching the age of technological advancement where we can do that for every single student, to help them learn when they're behind, to help them get even further ahead than they otherwise would have been. So the school of the future will not be experienced as the same experience by every student, but it'll be different for everyone because it'll be made just for them.
Uma das perguntas aqui, Zach, a gente sabe que Reino Unido, por exemplo, acabou de incluir programação no seu currículo para crianças, acho que a partir de 5 anos. Até uma pergunta da Alexandra, de São José do Rio Preto, que pergunta para vocês quais são os principais impactos de ensinar programação para crianças e qual é a melhor forma que você conhece. E se a Code Academy tem planos de ensinar para crianças também.
I think you'll hear from Mitch Resnick later this afternoon, who started Scratch, which I think is probably the best way for really young kids to get started learning programming. And I think the two of us are on the same page, that programming really inspires kids to be creative. It's not just a skill, but it's a different way of expressing yourself, a way of thinking differently, and a way of problem solving differently. And exposing kids to programming earlier on changes the rest of their learning trajectory. So I think what I think is that programming is again one of the key languages of the 21st century, and a lot of countries are starting to pick up on this. So the UK, as mentioned, Estonia is teaching all their students, and finally in the US we're starting to catch more steam on teaching programming in schools, because people are realizing the transformational impact that this new thinking on problem solving, the ability to create things has on students. And so as to whether we will end up supporting that eventually, I think Scratch does an absolutely amazing job of teaching younger students, and our focus is on students at the high school level and people who want to write code and real code in order to build real projects, as opposed to starting with the foundations of kind of algorithmic thinking like Scratch does.
Khan Academy also has coding. So one of my boys, who's really brilliant, again, I didn't know how brilliant, he came to me and said, "Mrs. E, in my free time, I learned how to code." How'd you learn how to code? Khan Academy has a special coding section, and he made, or however you say it, he created code for a Sudoku, which is something that we do every week, play the game Sudoku. So here's a 9-year-old who's free to explore and create and take risks, and he created his own Sudoku game using the coding program in Khan Academy.
Tem algumas perguntas aqui que tem a ver com como motivar, convencer os professores a abraçar essa ideia da inovação disruptiva, que argumentos usar para convencê-los, como criar espaços na escola de construção coletiva e colaborativa desses novos modelos, dessas novas possibilidades, como engajá-los, como prepará-los e como criar esse ambiente de construção coletiva.
I think one of the first things really is to make sure that the language you use is accessible. And I think skills are a perfect example of that. When we first came up with this idea, it was a think tank came up with the idea for studio schools, and they described them as focusing on non-cognitive skills. Nobody, apart from perhaps 1,000 people, know what non-cognitive skills are. And the people who do know what they are argue about the meaning of it. It's language that actually shuts out the majority of teachers. If you start talking about interpersonal skills or social skills or employability skills, people get that far faster. So I think if you're going to innovate, you require determined people who want to do that, but you also have to make sure that it's open to all, or it's just going to become a niche thing that won't spread. We also took a very conscious decision that we'd create new schools rather than programs within schools. And our thinking there was that many initiatives depend on leaders of the schools who are very interested in that. So they push that agenda within the school. If that school leader was to be knocked down by the next bus that happened to be passing along, what happens to that innovation? The answer is very often it simply falls by the wayside because it's not been institutionalized. So I think trying to make sure you've got a framework that gives it gives a longer life to whatever you're doing is really important.
Sure, I'll just add that I think start with well, two things that I think are important of it. One, I wouldn't use the language of disruptive innovation, actually, because I think that can sound threatening, but I would instead start with a problem that people across the school see that they want to solve and get better at, or a goal that you want to achieve together. And start with that discussion as your foundation point. And then the second thing is I would look to the exemplars that we're starting to see around the world, not to say we should do exactly that, but more to create a vision and a common language across the school of what's possible for teachers and the school to achieve together. What is the sky is the limit. What can this look like? And my sense, at least from the teachers that I talk to around the world, is that they don't want to be lecturing to 30 students realizing that they're only reaching a few of them at a time. That's not something that actually they get excited about in the morning. What they get excited about is, you used the word inspire. You said encourage. What were the other two? You had a few adjectives. Encourage, energize, and motivate. Gosh, I think every teacher in the world wants to do that when they reach every single student. And so if you can give them a vision for where they can and how they can do that in different ways, combining that with the problem and goal that you're trying to solve, I think you start to advance a really long way toward motivating all teachers to want to do this.
Meio que para finalizar aqui, o Eduardo Carvalho de Recife, ele pergunta que se tem um portal, se tem algum espaço na internet onde eles possam pesquisar essas boas práticas sobre as quais vocês estão falando, outras que possam ser inspiradoras. Obviamente, eu já vou puxar um pouco a sardinha para o nosso lado e dizer, vão no porvir.org. Mas certamente tem outros espaços aí que vocês podem dar uma dica para o público.
Sure. So at the Christensen Institute website, christenseninstitute.org, that's long and hard to spell, CHRISTENSEN institute.org, we have what's called the Blended Learning Universe, which are user-generated school profiles, case studies basically, of what different schools are doing. And you can look it up by the technology that they're using, by the type of blended learning model, the types of students that they're serving, the geography, all sorts of things you can search it by. And you can see different school models and read about what's working and what's not for them. And then that interfaces with the EdSurge database that actually rates the technology tools and gives teacher input with that, reviews the technology tools that are out there. So we think that the combination of those two assets together could be a pretty exciting way to show examples. And there are videos up there as well, so you can actually see what it looks like.